I'm Jimmy Lewis with Dirt Bike Test, and today we're talking about the 2019 450 motocross bikes. So we did a comparison. We're not going to call it a shootout because our original goal wasn't to pick a winner. So today I'm sitting here with Scott Hoffman, Ryan Nitzen, and Trevor Hunter, and we're going to break down these bikes. Our goal was to describe the bikes to you, not to go out and say this is the best one. We went to, 6 different tracks, I believe?
Yeah, pretty much most of Southern California's main tracks: Glen Helen, Paula, Tahia, Paris, as well as Cheney Ranch.
And of course, Milestone. So in that, we got a wide range of different tracks in that. We also spent time on each bike individually. Not with us today is we're missing
Dustin Hoffman, Travis Hoffman, David Morehouse.
I think that was it.
That's
it. 7, right? Good.
Yeah.
We're not very good at math. We're just good at riding dirt bikes. We're going to break these bikes down. We're going to give you the highs and lows of the characteristics. We're going to do it in our typical fashion. We're going to run through power. We're going to run through handling. We're going to run through suspension, and then kind of wrap it up with a conclusion. So we'll break these things down and give you the information you need. So here's where we're going to get into the power, and I would suspect that the 450 class is all about power. You agree?
No, of course.
Okay, and I think we're going to have a lot of different opinions on this, and so I would say we should all just yell out our favorite one for power, but that's not what we're going to do. We're going to try to go through, and I think clearly we can say there was one bike that stood out that had the most powerful motors. Anybody want to disagree with me?
Well, I thought you were going to say your favorite and we're all going to be different.
No, I was just going to tell him it was the Honda.
You're exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and that came across in all the opinions that the riders came back. The Honda is just a powerhouse, and I've seen dyno charts, they back it up, but my butt on the seat told me that every time I rode it, and in fact, for me, that was a little bit of a problem.
Well, it's like a fire-breathing dragon. That thing's so fast, it just pulls everywhere. I think it has the most power, but I don't know about the best power.
And
I
here's
disagree with you. I think it was the best power. But then again, I'm old school, and I used to ride CR500 sometimes, which had gobs and gobs of power. So this is to me like night and day. It's so smooth.
And the amazing thing, so what we've started to notice on a lot of the 4-strokes is that not only are they making lots of power, they're spreading it over a long range, and there's all different kinds of feel. And now you have couplers, you have tuning apps, you have push buttons, to make the bikes change like in literally seconds or minutes. You can have a whole new bike. So and the Honda even has maps in it.
Right.
And for me, even though the bike had a lot of power, I couldn't just put it in the mellow map. I just didn't like the characteristic of the mellow map. It didn't work. I was either I found on some tracks the advanced map was the most rideable one for me. And here's where you have to understand that when we start talking about power, when I start talking about low end, it might be mid-range for Ryan, and for other people, even someplace where I'm talking about low end, they think that's top end. Because you think about it, like where are you in your throttle position and what's going on. So it's kind of a heated subject. And I know, for instance, I always me and Scott argue quite heavily about power all the time. And
right.
Scott, where he
According
feels,
to Jimmy.
yeah, where he feels like bottom end, he likes to wait and then really get on it. So he does these big throttle openings at kind of a lower RPM, and so where he feels hit is a completely different place than when I feel hit. So this is where it's really important to go back and kind of look at our different opinions when we post them on the website, where you can pick us apart and you can say, I relate to what he's saying, or I relate to him. So we've kind of clearly established that the Honda is the kind of horsepower king.
But to back things up a little bit, now the last year to 2 years, and especially this year when a lot of the motorcycles have changed, and especially with electronics, even Honda has a different ECU setting for each gear and different throttle positions. And to me, it's like they've connected the motor and the throttle to the rear tire more than they've ever done in the past. And I think kind of KTM started with this, and I think Kawasaki and Honda and even Yamaha have adapted that rideability. But instead of making more power, they have made a little more power, but they've made that power more rideable.
But Yamaha did better than Honda.
Yes, I agree.
not in my opinion.
Yeah. So here's where I feel that Yamaha, and then we have a few riders, and I think you're included, that really like what the Husky did, and then the Husky and the KTM are kind of identical, and I think the biggest difference is, there's two differences: the air intake, the way that the Husky versus the KTM air intake, and I think all of us would say that the KTM is a little bit more aggressive.
Yep.
Than the Husky. Just on the power, the KTM and Husky, it's you're dealing with exactly the same motor, exactly the same mapping from what I'm told. You never get a clear answer, but I'm told. But the difference is in the air intake, and it affects the way the bikes handle. The other thing that is different is the clutch activation. So KTM uses Brembo, and Husky uses Magura. And so the way the clutch activation comes into play also changes the way you feel the power. And this is the kind of stuff we want to break down and explain. And I preferred the KTM with 100% certainty over the Husky every single time. And you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I disagree with Jimmy as well.
Yeah.
I agree with Jimmy.
Yeah. And so here's the difference. Scott and I are heavier, and these guys are lighter. And then the other thing I noticed is if you like to turn the throttle a little bit more and let the clutch out, as opposed to let the clutch out and turn the throttle, you like the Husky.
Yeah.
But if you like to just let the clutch out and go, and Scott likes to, I know this is all I always pick on him. Scott likes to let the clutch out and turn a big handful of throttle to get the bike to go, and I like to let it out at very low RPMs and roll it on. So that little bit more of response worked for me. So you have bikes that are almost identical that are pulling us apart, polar opposite opinions.
I thought the Husky actually had really good power on it. The first day at Milestone, I didn't notice it as much in comparison to the day at Glen Helen, but going up some of those hills, there's a couple rollers going up the hill, and I was able to grab a gear and leave it in that gear all the way up the hill, as opposed to on some of the other bikes I was having to shift like midway through. I thought the Husky and the KTM revved a lot higher, it felt like, for me, going up some of those hills rather than some of the Japanese bikes.
Yeah, and I think collectively, when you look at all the opinions, the Honda motor, everybody says, is the fastest. The KTM and Husky, they tend to be a little bit more revvy motors. The power's strung up a little bit higher in the power band. Not saying that it's lacking all that much on the bottom, but then you have the Kawasaki, you have the Yamaha, and then you have the Suzuki. Is there a motor in that group that's bad?
I couldn't say there's a bad motor. They're different motors for sure, but I wouldn't say one is worse than the other. Just all depends on what you like and how you ride and all that. But nothing stands out as like bad.
Even for all of us, like, we have different riding styles, and I think that is a big part of it. I like almost all the bikes in that mellow, smoother setting. I just find it's a lot easier to ride, more manageable power. Like, they all make so much power, but it's how about you put that power to the ground versus just having so much. And you're the CR500 guy, where there's never too much power, but I think, in my opinion, there is.
And you guys use traction control on the KTM and the Husky.
That was
I
really
hated
cool.
it.
Yeah. Oh, I liked it. I thought it was. But I didn't use it at Milestone, really. Only at Glen Helen on some of those inside turns. I feel like I could just get in there real deep, and I never had to worry about it breaking loose.
But again, you guys are lighter riders, and the wheel is going to have the more. It's going to spin up easier. We've got a lot more weight putting on the rear wheel. But going back to the Husky and the KTM, to me, it's like there was from zero throttle to barely cracking it. It almost had too much initially. Then I had to actually use the clutch to slip to hold it into the groove
on the Husky and the KTM.
Yeah, then I had to give it. Then once I got the bike 3/4 out of the corner, I gave it a lot of throttle. Then it felt like it was sluggish. Then once it got straight up, then turn it. Then it started building the power again. It's like this bizarro world.
And I'm the exact opposite, where I just didn't feel like either the Husky or the KTM, specifically the Husky, didn't have that roll on when I let the clutch out. The KTM a little bit more, and so it's throttle position. It's what we're calling. It's like what Scott refers to as low end, and maybe for me that was mid range or vice versa. So it is pretty particular. Let's kind of talk about some of the other ones. The Suzuki, I would call the Suzuki a standard issue 450 motor. It has chug, it has torque, so it's kind of like, it's a little bit like the Honda in certain ways, just not at the same amount. And then as it goes up, I think a lot of people will say it doesn't have the top end of the other bikes, but I always found myself when you get to the top end of the other bikes, you start running into a traction problem. They're spinning, and I passed other 450s, some of our other test riders on 450s, going up the uphill at Glen Helen on the Suzuki.
I thought it was like, it has a really good base setting. It is a very, like you said, a standard issue. It does everything well. The motor is strong, but it maybe isn't as powerful up top as the Honda or the Yamaha.
I think it's good, the Suzuki. It's easy to ride. I think it's probably one of the, if you're, getting back into a 450 or like
Stepping
up, I would say that's a great motor. It does.
Now, the
to
KTM
me,
and the Husky are better for stepping up from 250F. But
to me,
keep going.
the Suzuki, it feels like it's like one generation back. It's a little bit older school style of delivery, which is not bad. It's just it's a little bit different style of delivery compared to the little bit more connected to the rear tire compared to some of the newer bikes.
And so when we're talking about, like for me specifically, when we're talking about the Honda, which definitely has the most power, and the Suzuki, I prefer the Suzuki motor because it's like the Honda motor with 10% of the power taken out, and I can put down laps and it works great and it's drivable. Move on to the Kawasaki. I think the Kawasaki is very similar in a lot of ways to the Suzuki, but it's a step a little more lively, a little more responsive. It has some more tuning options that with the mapping machine tuning tool, you can do some stuff too. And like I said, both the Suzuki and the Kawasaki have couplers you can put on them, and they do some changes as well. So the motors are, I don't think the KX really stands out any place, but it's definitely an improvement from the old KX. Which I unfortunately I preferred the old one to the new one, but the new one's really not that bad.
I think
it's good.
The new bike it's really connected to the ground, and with the rear suspension on the KX, for some reason to me, when you roll that throttle on, if for some reason it allows the rear tire to really track the bumps, and it seems like that's where it makes it so smooth, where the power does give that really cool feel. To me, the stock power is a little bit more too linear. It doesn't build quick enough up top, like in the mid. So that's why I use the power tuner. But unfortunately, the power tuner is something that you just can't get. You can't rent at a dealership. You have to buy them, and they're $700.
Yeah.
Which is, they work really good, but that's the difference. Is that you need to borrow one from a buddy, learn how to use it, put in your maps.
Or you just use the stock couplers.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about my favorite bike, the Yamaha. The motor. So I would say that the Yamaha to me feels like the freest revving. I think the KTM and the Husky also rev pretty free, but the Yamaha, I felt like it was the freest revving on the bottom and into the mid. Just the wrist to rear wheel connectivity. When Scott talks about that with the Honda, this is what I talk about on the Yamaha, and I actually am a geek when it comes to playing with the FI tuner and stuff like that.
we know.
And the Yamaha is so simple and easy. I hardly had to use it. In fact, I didn't. The best map was the stock map, which is really strange.
This Yamaha tuner?
Yeah, that Yamaha tuner. That's kind of like a broken iPhone, but
it's still, I have my Yamaha tuner in my phone right here.
And it's free.
It's free. Yeah.
Actually, you don't even have to own a Yamaha, and you can have that.
Yeah.
And I think at any point in the power band, it could be making the most power, maybe not on top, but sometimes for me it is on top because I can tune and I can slow the rate of RPM increase up there and really get it to go, and it makes it so easy. So I like that motor. Some people felt it didn't have the hit, some people felt it didn't have the outright power and different things, but that motor was just wrist to rear wheel connectivity and really solid in my book.
I almost liked the power of the Yamaha, but I almost like it last year before they did the gearing change. I think to me it hooked up better for me, and although I liked the gearing change, I could use third gear a little bit more, but overall I kept asking Travis Preston, I go, what'd you do to the motor? Why does it feel like it revs through and it hits so much harder than it did last year? And I keep thinking, and he's like, well, the gearing, and I'm like, oh, it's the gearing. It's so much different. And I felt
like it used the power better and lasted longer. So here's where the exact same bike, two different opinions, and that's why it is important to for us to be able to ride these things back to back and try to explain as the best we can. I don't think you'd be disappointed with any of these bikes in power, and on top of that, if you were going to rate them on, let's just say on a scale of 1 to 10, is there a motor that ranks below an 8.5?
Not
No,
my.
they're all super strong.
Maybe the Honda for me.
Yeah, I like.
Oh, because it's too powerful.
Just the Honda is just way too much power.
Don't
for
worry,
me.
you'll grow some of this
So-
later.
Now, Trevor, you're the lightest rider in this test, and not necessarily a dedicated 450 rider. Now, you rode all the bikes, and the Yamaha is one of your favorite motors.
Yeah, Yamaha is right up there with one of my favorite motors. What really did it for me is just being able to use that Power Tuner app. The Yamaha guys helped me with a smoother, mellower map, and once I put that in, I fell in love with the bike and the motor.
That tuner app's really next level. I think
Yeah.
that makes it an even playing field for anyone who has one of these bikes. And
Now, how would you equate a value on that alone? I mean, Yamaha. We always talk about this tuner app that comes with the motorcycle. Now, is there a dollar amount or just a simplicity?
I
amount?
always say that tuner is like, it's like buying 15 pipes, 4 cams, and some jetting that you could never do on your own, but you can do so quickly. And it, like I said, it takes that bike and it makes it so much more versatile than the other ones. You're just kind of pushing buttons or changing couplers or having to buy something that's very expensive. Not that any of the other ones are bad. It's just, I think the Yamaha just goes tuning to infinite.
the thing that I thought was cool is the guys at Yamaha told me that you won't be able to hurt the bike. You can take everything full max and full minimum, and you'll never hurt it.
And they
That's something that I thought was a really big.
Yeah, they program it in so it's idiot proof, so there's no way somebody with their phone can mess up their motorcycle.
Right.
Okay, so we're gonna cut it on power. There's no clear-cut winner here.
The Honda has the most power, but
Yeah.
the best power, that's for you to decide.
Yeah.
I'm like, the Honda is my favorite power stock. But then again, the Cowie with the power tuning $700 computer, that makes it into a bike I really like. And the Yamaha, of course, is so tunable. Now the Husky and the KTM, I like the power, but
It's different power.
But it's just different, and I don't think I've had enough time on those motorcycles in the last 2 seasons, other than day here, day there, to really understand it. Where I've spent more time on some of the other motorcycles.
For me, they felt like the Husky and the KTM turned the motors into like almost 350s. I mean, they're making 450 power, but the power is strung up higher. It's more of a progressive curve, where a lot of the other bikes are a little more linear and spread, and the Honda might just have a lump that goes over everything. So that's the power. Hopefully that confused you more than it confused us, but they're all really good. Suspension. This is going to be a little bit easier. I think we're in a lot more agreement here that the Yamaha has probably the widest range of keeping people happy.
The best overall package.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much, if you've got a guy that's 155 pounds, you got a guy that's 210 pounds with sag setup and very little clicker changes, all of us like that motorcycle. It's the most versatile with the least amount of setup of all the motorcycles.
Yeah, I rode it almost the entire comparison in stock clickers. I played around a little bit with high speed and other than that, and collectively amongst the group, it's the one that had the least amount of changes on the suspension charts and stuff. So I think they've done really good, and there's not a lot of confusion in that. Then we can go down to the other end of the spectrum, and we'll talk about the Suzuki. It's not that it's horrible. It's actually a lot better than I expected it to be. The Suzuki was, I would say, stiff initially, and then it kind of moved through the stroke a little quick, but it still had good bottoming resistance.
It's almost hard to get it settled for me. Did you have that issue too? Getting into a corner, it was a little stiff up top, but then it would.
Well, when it goes in and settles, it's great, and that's what makes it turn good. We'll get into that in handling. But our lighter riders for sure complained about it's a combination of stiff initial suspension and some chassis rigidity that goes along with it. So it's not that bad, but it's not as good as some of the other bikes, and it does show that stuff. As well as the shock does not have high speed compression adjustment, and a lot of people don't really understand what that does. It's not like high speed is in the bike's going fast. It controls the attitude of the bike while you're riding and some of the way that it hits certain bumps, but it's mostly controlling the attitude. I wanted to change that a lot on the Suzuki, and I had to start playing around with the rebound to kind of mask it. The rebound had an effect on high speed. So it was a little tougher. We had a lot of people clicking around trying to get bump compliance, but then when they got bump compliance, they got chassis movement. So it was moving too much, or it got too soft on them. So that's kind of at the other end of the spectrum. And then we have the other 4 bikes they're stuck somewhere in the middle. Let's talk about the Honda. Stiffer on the side. You guys basically.
Yeah, it's no bueno for me. I'm lighter rider and I'm not like 450, like not comfortable on 450s really. So getting on the Honda is really stiff and it just didn't work for me.
So I thought the rear shock on the Honda was pretty good. Initially, it was a good setup. The forks, I had a little bit of stiffness in the front, but a couple of clicks out on that at the end of the day. I also rode that the very beginning of the day and the very end of the day, so I had definitely two completely different bike setups, different track conditions, but it was okay for me.
And then Scott, you're on the other end of the spectrum. You're heavier, and you had an issue with it too.
No, I had issues with it. I liked it at Milestone. I rode the bike individually by myself one day, and I got a pretty good setup, but I could still feel that firmness. And I think it's because for me, I'm actually riding even too low in the stroke. I think I need springs on that motorcycle in order to be able to have the bike ride a little higher, but also be able to back out some of the clickers. Yeah. And Honda was able to get the bike working pretty well, but we had actually had to drop the forks and the clamps and mess around with some rebound on the rear in order to get it to go across the bumps and soak them up, opposed to deflect off them.
Yeah, and I'm probably the target weight for the Honda, maybe a little bit slower in what their ability level or average rider is, and for me it worked really good. It just had a stiffer nature, and I thought that I felt too much of the ground where it kind of acted the same as the Yamaha in a really good way. Everything was working, but I just felt more of the ground, and I'd rather feel less of the ground. Other than that, I think they did. And the clickers on the Honda really work. They make a difference. Then let's move on to the Kawasaki. Some people here, I think Ryan specifically thought the Kawasaki had a magic shock.
Yeah, I think the rear shock if I could have the forks off the Yamaha and the shock off the Kawasaki, that'd be my best bike. I think I didn't have to sacrifice power to corner, like where you let off to make the corner. I felt like on the Cowie, I was able to just let the rear wheel bite the whole way as I turned, and that was something I really enjoyed about that bike.
Well, the Cowie still has a little bit longer chassis and a longer bike feel, and to me the suspension worked. Again, I like the rear shock as well. The suspension worked really well. I mean, in order to get it dialed in, we actually put one spring
we have to bring
stiffer on one fork leg, so we actually ran like a 0.52 on one side of the fork. And to me, that really helped balance the motorcycle out for my weight. I mean, I rode the bike stock as well as we rode it with both.
Everybody that rode it stock just felt it was a little too busy, and that just stabilized the bike.
Right. And everybody, pretty much anybody from all the way from like 165 all the way up, really liked that minor change, and that's a $65 to $75 modification.
Yeah, and lighter guys,
Yeah, I didn't have too many problems with the Cowie suspension. The shock for me, like a little danced around a little bit too much to really that's why I wasn't on the Yamaha level. I was happy with the fork, just the shock. I couldn't get it to settle coming into the corners.
And I thought it worked great, pretty much 90% of the time. But there was this just certain thing going into jump faces where I felt it was this weird transition where I feel it used a little bit too much stroke, and that's just specific to me. I didn't see that and I know Dustin really liked it, and there was a couple of other riders that just raved about the rear end of the Kawasaki.
Yeah, I thought the way the rear shock, the power, and the rear tire worked together was a great setup on the Cowie.
Yeah, the linkage might not be quite as stiff enough towards the latter part of the stroke, or again, I think a slightly stiffer spring would hold that up and make that difference.
And it was nothing. I couldn't get rid of it.
Trevor.
I couldn't get rid of it with clickers. Anytime I varied with the clickers, the high-speed compression in one direction or another, it compromised something to get me the other feel. Right. So it was robbing Peter to pay Paul. So, but overall, pretty good. Then we'll move on to the KTM and the Husky, which essentially have the same suspension, but the chassis kind of delivers a little bit of a different feel. And we even had some people that said, man, that Husky worked really good, and other people like the KTM was like magic, and vice versa. So again, you have something that's technically kind of the same, and on paper I found them exactly the same, in that if I did one change on the KTM, like I was kind of playing around with the high-speed compression on almost every bike, but when I changed it on the KTM, I went and rode the Husky later, and I wanted to make the exact same change. So they mirrored and follow each other. And we have to bring up that this is the only bike. These are the only two bikes in the comparison that have an air fork.
Yeah.
And that's basically a 5-pound weight loss.
And you notice it on the track. It feels lighter.
and a different sensation and a feel. There's what we call the air fork feel, which I get crap for it all the time. I like the air forks. I like the air forks in the old bikes that I think collectively all of you guys hated, right?
Yeah, I've had previous air fork experience that really left a bad taste in my mouth, so I was hesitant to even ride these bikes. Honestly, when I heard that they were on the air fork, I was like, I don't know.
But they've simplified it. It's one chamber. It's easy to use. It's easy, especially for someone that's outside the weight range, to make a spring change with a pump and get it in the zone. So that's an advantage. It's a perception. I think the media definitely gave the air fork in some ways what it deserved, and they just didn't give it a chance. But I thought that those bikes are one click sensitive to me, both the Husky and the KTM. If I was one or two clicks off, or the ride height just wasn't correct, and this is something I have to bring up also, is that we have the manufacturers come out and they will not let us go out unless we set the sag or the ride height on the bikes, because they know that wrecks the motorcycle, and it just doesn't. The bikes don't work, and on the KTM's it was really critical and made a big difference.
And usually by the time we're getting into a 450 comparison, the OEMs, they know what works, so they're pretty much, they direct us towards what they think is going to work best for us. And believe it or not, the Husky and the KTM might have a different feel for some riders, because they have a different handlebar. One's got a Pro Taper, one does not. So the Pro Taper to me has a little bit more flex in it, so it gives the bike a little bit softer
and the
feel.
stock bend is a little bit different.
And the bend's different,
A little more
and also the triangulation of the subframe might contribute a little bit into the chassis flex. That because one's composite plastic, one's not. But for both bikes on the first day, I just chase settings because I think it's just too soft. I mean, the first day,
and KTM and Husky both are very particular about, you need to have the right rate shock spring.
Right.
They knew going in that you were going to be a little bit on the light side, and you were going to be too heavy, and they over preloaded it for you and under preloaded it for you, and that affected the way that the bike works. So there's some of that in there where somehow magically the Yamaha gets away with it. I think the Honda, it doesn't get away with it for you. It kind of did. Well, you wanted springs too.
It's good, but it's But I mean, both those bikes, the front end was really busy for me. Both on the first day one, day two was when I finally got those guys to add some air to the fork, and they did a bunch of changes. It wasn't until the end of the day that KTM finally made some more drastic changes by really slowing down the rebound on the KTM, and it got a little bit more firm, but it finally stopped dancing around for me. But it took 2 days of chasing around with a tech to get the bike to a comfortable place for me.
So I was pleasantly surprised with both of those bikes. I went into it thinking, oh man, it's gonna be an air fork kind of feel, but I was very surprised and happy with both bikes. For me, the rougher it got at Glen Helen, like at the middle of the day, it was getting pretty bumpy. The bike handled great. Like it was getting better as it got rougher for me.
There wasn't a bike in this test that I couldn't get to work. I would say I struggled a little bit with the Suzuki, just in feel. The Honda, I struggle with feel, but not performance. It never did anything wrong.
Like you said, the Husky and the KTM, they're, in my opinion, they're race machines. They're like you said, one click away from being a big difference. That's something I noticed too.
Yeah.
I felt with just the KTM and the Husky, Scott mentioned the handlebars and the subframe are different. And to me, the KTM felt really harsh, whereas the Husky felt soft and plush and like compliant. More so at Milestone than Glen Helen, but still the KTM felt more harsh.
We're using the same clickers.
Yes.
From both bikes.
Yes,
too.
and so the KTM I ended up going a little softer.
And that's
the same thing.
common across the the feel, and that I think that runs more into the chassis side of things and stuff, and we'll get into that for sure. So there's definitely, I think the suspension is a little more polar for us. We can describe it a little bit better. There are changes. It's not like we have to argue about some of this stuff.
But hands down, the Yamaha fit the most variety of our riders with the least amount of setup, where all the other bikes took a little bit more setup to actually find a spot where it got better, then actually worse, then back to better. For the Yamaha, 2 clicks here and there. I was one stiff front compression and one slow on rebound. That was it. And it was pretty much dialed in.
Yeah, as a complete package, I think we agree with the Yamaha.
Yeah, it's right there with you guys.
Handling. This is probably the area that gives the bikes the most characteristics. Ideally, you want a bike that works as a package, and I'm pretty sure that that's what these manufacturers are working on. When you start talking about how the power works, how the suspension works, it all ties into the handling. And when you're upset with maybe the power delivery or maybe not so happy with how the suspension works, it all kind of rolls back onto the handling. And I would venture to say from reading everybody's notes that we don't have a clear-cut winner here. No?
No.
So right off the top, we're going to start with the Yamaha, because this is an area where we're all kind of torn a little bit about, some people say the Yamaha's a little wide.
Yeah, for me personally, it felt a little wide when you sit in it. I don't know if it's where the airbox and the shrouds, the seat maybe feels a little wider than the other models as well. But on the track, it feels very stable. It doesn't feel wide like a tractor, and it just feels stable on the track.
Yeah. And in reality, sometimes we talk about like how connected the wrist to the rear wheel is, or how the suspension works. And for me, with the Yamaha, everything works really good. But at the same time, I don't think it has. It doesn't stand out in any one area for the handling. And you have a good point on this too.
Oh, I think the Yamaha it's not. I agree with Jeremy. It's not like stand out great, but it does everything so good that it's hard to not put it right up front with some of the best of them.
But you also like.
But I also like the Husky, where the Husky is stable, but it still corners really well. And I think everything just works as a good package.
It feels the lightest too.
It feels really light. Yamaha, doesn't feel the lightest for sure, but it's pretty light in my opinion.
Yeah, and for me, the Yamaha doesn't feel the lightest, but it doesn't have like a true flavor. It doesn't work like at different tracks. It kind of takes on a little bit different character. Where the Honda and the Suzuki, to me, are probably the two best handling bikes in a lot of ways. And what are they? The two stiffest, most rigid chassis. So it's how you get this feedback. And then there's a certain place where the KTM and the Husky and then the Kawasaki kind of in the middle of that really work. And Scott can probably play to this.
Well, I mean, if you wanted, because we're talking about the Yamaha, because that's, we're leaning towards that as being, collectively one of our favorite bikes. And for the Yamaha, I think when you ride it back to back, which most of you aren't able to ever do, is ride all 6 motorcycles on one day, or we were able to. When you ride the Yamaha by itself on a day, a lot of these little things you don't even notice.
Right.
It's just when we're going back to back, you feel the little bit of the thickness and some of the way that the ergonomics work around. But for me, I jumped on the Honda, and to me, it's the most accurate motorcycle. If I was going to race, I would buy a Honda. But if I'm just going to go do track riding, have fun, I would probably buy the Yamaha because it's so versatile. Doesn't do anything weird, odd, or nothing stand out like the Honda. So accurate. It would be the Yamaha or the Kawasaki chassis. Those are my two most stable and easy to ride, and you can be lazy on it and just go track ride with your buddies.
And it's not like the old days where there were bikes that were unstable. I don't think any of the bikes are unstable here as long as the ride height and suspension is in the ballpark.
I think on the Honda, it was almost like if you look somewhere, that's where the bike's going. Like it's that accurate.
Yep, and for me, I would say the Honda is a little more, I would say, kind of like a sharp knife than the Suzuki. But when the way they go in the turns, and that's an area I think the Yamaha has really improved in. The little stuff they did between 18 and 19 made a big difference in how the Yamaha improved. And then the KTM and Husky, they took the step to go in a lighter, they're lighter feeling bikes, and I think that made them a little more polar. They got a little more, setup dependent, and then it was interesting how some people really liked them and some people didn't. And then I really fought and struggled with the Husky. I couldn't feel what the wheels were doing, and with the KTM I could feel what the wheels were doing, and then it was like, okay. But so there was a little inconsistency, and then but the Honda and the Suzuki, I knew what the wheels are doing, and
Yeah.
you like the Yamaha and the Husky. So it's how do you and so we start talking about other things. I think Kawasaki really stepped it up on the brakes, maybe too far.
Yes, I mean the Kawasaki brake is so good, but if you don't learn to let it off as you're going into a corner, you actually get some front end knifing. And
Yeah.
some people were attributing that to suspension or the chassis. Well, it was actually the brakes are so good, you actually have to let off as you're getting tighter into the corner, or you get a little bit of a knife. Little things like that change the way the whole chassis works.
And I struggled with the brake pedal on the KTM and the Husky. And I can
that's-
get a 2016 brake pedal. That'd be the first mod I did to either of those bikes, and I promise you it would make the bike so much better because I was missing the brake
Yeah.
pedal. It's very narrow.
It was narrow. Mine standard was a little too high. I kept kicking it. That's an easy fix, but
Yeah, and I had adjusted on some of the, and that was one of the things. So some of the adjustments I was making on bikes, I was really picky about brake pedal height.
Mm-hmm.
I was very picky about the lever position, where the lever's engaged and things like that. And then I didn't feel the need to change the bar position, but you guys have a bar position issue.
yeah, on the Cowie, I always ran it back. I like kind of a smaller cockpit, so I'd run. There's different positions for the handlebars on the Kawasaki. I'd run them back, roll them down a little bit. What about the pegs on the Yamaha? How'd you like that?
Well, I didn't have any problems with it, but I know it was like foot peg to seat to mostly handlebar, right, Scott?
Yeah, well, there's two things that the Yamaha since they're switching bikes to bike. When I got on the Yamaha, I noticed that even last year when they first came out with this new bike, the peg to seat height is shorter but it helps you get into the pocket. It makes the bike turn. But they've got a tall handlebar, so it's like either a taller seat or a lower handlebar. And I found out that the 250F bar mounts are actually lower than the 450, so that they are different. So you can just put 250F bar mounts on the 450 if you feel that sensation.
One thing that Trevor and I talked about is the pegs on the Yamaha standard feel like an oversized peg.
Yeah.
In my opinion, those were awesome pegs.
And for me, the pegs on the Husky and the KTM feel like sharpened gripper,
Yeah.
pegs. So you can see where we're going to start nitpicking things, and these little things, and you'll see a lot of these in our comments when we start putting our personal opinions up there. So the Kawasaki, like I said, they kind of stepped it up on the brakes, and for me, if I got used to those brakes, I would start feeling like all the other bikes' brakes were not as good. And Glen Helen, like with their downhills, really showed the brakes. I really enjoyed the KTM and Husky front brake.
Yeah.
And they felt a little bit different, but they have the strength, almost the strength of the Kawasaki,
And it's
but
like
a lot
super progressive. You can just hold it on.
really good control. I think the Honda has really good brakes. They've stepped their brake game up, and it's funny even talking to the Yamaha guys. There was, hey, what do you think of the other brakes? What do you think? Because obviously there's a game there. What are we going to work on for next year, and how sensitive these bikes are. I think the Yamaha brakes were just completely standard. I know. We had some notes that said the Suzuki brakes were kind of interesting. We actually backbled them, so we forced some air out of the brakes.
I personally really like the front brake on the Suzuki. It was the modulation, the way it feels. I don't know. It was a weird thing, but I really liked it.
After we backbled it, I thought it was great too. And as far as like little things that stand out, comfort, we say the Yamaha looks wide. It definitely looks a lot more narrow than it used to. And I think when you start measuring things, you notice that it actually isn't that wide, but it's a visual perception. To me, the narrowest bike is the Suzuki. It felt just lean and narrow through the middle. And then we can talk about weight here as well. We have scale weights. You can see what the bikes actually weighed on our scales. Which the scales are consistent. Our weights tend to be a little bit higher than some other weights you've seen published, but at least the numbers are consistent. I don't think in the KTM and the Husky are 10 pounds lighter than at least 10 pounds lighter on the scales than all the other bikes, but when you're riding them, I didn't necessarily feel that. The heaviest is the Suzuki.
Yeah.
I don't think I would claim that the Suzuki, to me, sometimes the Honda felt the heaviest,
I agree.
and then there was
Disagree.
yeah. And so when we sit around and talk about it. When you talk about there's certain guys that whip and throw the bike off the jumps, and they have a completely different sensation than Jimmy that just goes straight off the top of the jumps. In the way that they ride. Some people like the rear end to slide as opposed to the front end to track.
That's like Dustin Hoffman, one of our test riders. He will equate how light a bike feels is when it's in the air. How easy it is for him to whip that thing or get it upside down. That's how he determines a bike.
Yeah.
On its weight.
I definitely noticed the weight of the KTM and the Husqvarna on the track. It definitely felt a lot lighter to me. Personally, picking up the Honda off the stand, it felt heavy, but on the track, that bike felt really light. Something I noticed.
Yeah, it for some reason, I don't know why it felt, it's almost that it was more stable and it felt more planted, so it stuck to the ground. So I determine weight kind of sometimes in the turns, when you're in the turn and how the bike's getting knocked or kicked around. And then there's also when it's kind of in the bumps, when it's sort of dancing, and that's sort of why I feel the weight. I'm not feeling it because my back end is whipping around in front of the front tire.
But there's so many of these small little things, and some people will pick these out, but because we were able to ride all the bikes back to back, that's why we were able to notice some of these things. Like if you rode the KTM, the Husky all day, just you probably wouldn't notice the rear brake being that far out of whack because you would adjust yourself to it. Like the Kawasaki, for example, the grips are really, really small. My meat hooks actually stick out over the edge. And some people don't like the thin front brake lever, but these are all things.
I love that.
These are all things. These are all things that are fixable for if you don't like them, or if you like them, you can keep them.
$700 fix for all those things.
Or even less than that.
Yeah.
Handlebars $100. Fork spring $100. So these bikes are tunable to each rider. That's the biggest thing. But we always go back to the Yamaha. Yamaha to me is like utilitarian. It handles across the board for so many people. It might not be the best handling for me. I like the Honda with a couple little tweaks.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the Yamaha turns the best. I wouldn't say it's the most stable.
Right.
Doesn't feel the lightest. There's nothing that it does that like stands out. And in fact, other than like the suspension,
Right.
there's not an area that the Yamaha actually excels.
Yeah.
But what we start thinking about here is sometimes, and I adapt pretty quickly to a bike, the way that the bike works, and so if you spend time on the bikes and get used to it, if I spent 2 days on a bike and then I come to a shootout, that bike, I'm going to favor that bike and the characteristics that bike has. And then when you start moving to the other ones, so it's not so clear cut on this is better than this. This is really hard for any. It's different. It's a flavor of an ice cream, and I'm not going to tell you that chocolate is better than vanilla is better than strawberry. It's like you have a particular flavor, and it's like identifying which bike has the most characteristics.
However, though, I would not suggest the Honda chassis for a beginner novice. I would say that the Yamaha or the Cali or even the KTM and Husky or even the Suzuki, the Honda is the one bike I would not let a more of a amateur or beginner novice kind of guy ride.
And I think, and then another characteristic that we're going to talk about with KTM and the Husky is I think the KTM and the Husky are a lot more suited for a rider that's moving up off of a 250F. Kind of a little bit to do with the lightness that's familiar to them, and also the way that the power characteristic, or the characteristic of the power seems to run a little higher in the RPM and stuff, and then move down. So we can sit here and break down these bikes in all different kinds of ways. So it's really important that you kind of, if you're really thinking about one, look at the opinions and see if that sort of suits your style. So here's what you've been waiting for. This is the conclusion. So which bike did we like overall? In the beginning, we kind of went in and we didn't think we would ever come up with a winner because there's so many different tastes and varieties, and even after the first day, we were all over the place. After the second day, things started solidifying, and then today, when we got everybody's opinions in, we were kind of surprised. So I'm going to pass it around the horn, and we're going to see where we're at. Scott?
All right, for me, I actually have 3 motorcycles that were considered my favorites, and for different reasons. Number 1, the Honda, just because of the power and the handling. It's so accurate. When I'm on my game, it just wants to go wherever I want. But it would be my favorite bike with some suspension work and maybe springs, but I don't know that for a fact. Number 2 was KX. I think that for a Kawasaki, it's the best KX they've ever made. Power-wise, handling-wise, this bike actually turns with the front wheel, or you can ride it with the rear. The only issues is that made it not my favorite bike is the front fork needed that spring, and I need to use the power tuning kit that sells for $700. That's the only reason it held back. Then there's the Yamaha. The Yamaha does everything well. It's maybe not my favorite in a couple spots, but it's utilitarian. It does everything well, works good motor, good power, good handling. It just nothing sticks out enough to make it above the Honda or Cowie with a couple fixes.
But then the one thing you always keep bringing up is if I were Just riding for fun, track day, practice day versus racing.
Well, okay, if I was racing, which I don't do that often, I would pick the Honda hands down with some modification. Because I'm more of a track vet guy, go out to have fun. I could either live all day long with the Cowie or the Yamaha.
Yeah, excellent.
So I personally ride a Honda 2018 450. So coming into this test, I was expecting to really like the Honda with its revisions for this year. I like the bike; it's great. The power is good. The handling is very sharp. My second favorite, or very close to the top, is the Cowie. The power, the hydraulic clutch, the E-Start. I think that bike has got a lot of great revisions this year, and it really stands out. But if I had to buy a bike off the showroom floor in the morning and go race it in the afternoon, it would be the Yamaha. Like what Scott said, it does everything well. The suspension, I would say, is best in the class. The overall package, the pegs, the rider cockpit area, the power app, I think that kind of sets that bike apart for me.
But for you, you're saying they're all pretty stinking close.
Yeah, even the Husqvarna too. For me, like if 4 bikes were really neck and neck all the way to the last laps at Glen Helen on a Thursday when it's the most brutal track in Southern California. So
the KTM came close to falling into my top 3, but it was just a small little spot below it.
even with the Suzuki, with maybe an electric start and a couple more days on the bike to get the suspension working right, and that bike would be right in the mix too. But if we have to pick 1 or 4, I guess, as
how
all
close
as
they are, yeah.
exactly, they're all really close.
Trevor, what'd you think?
For me, I mean, I've been on Yamahas for a while, but I gotta say I was never a fan of the older generation 450. It was just too fast, too big of a bike for me to handle. So I really wasn't even looking forward to riding the Yamaha coming into this. But with 2 days on the bike, I fell in love with it. The motor is, it's not, I wouldn't say the best, but it's so good. It's probably like top 2 or 3. Suspension, I'd say is the best for me.
But you had a tie.
But-
You and Dustin and a couple others, when you rank them, when you say you say these 3 or these 4, you had these 2.
Yep. And for me, the Husky was right there with it. So I had the Yamaha and Husky tied for first. The Husky, just overall, the motor, I love the motor. It was easy to ride, but it still had plenty of power. The suspension was really good, and it handled and turned really well too. So it was they're both, the Husky and the Yamaha, they're just really good. Yeah.
And so for me, it was clear cut. I mean, I absolutely, with 100% certainty, like the Yamaha. I liked it last year. I liked that in the Kawasaki last year. Kawasaki kind of changed flavors for me this year. I think it's better for most riders, but the Yamaha just absolutely stood out. And here's where I'm different than a lot of the other guys. I like the KTM a lot better than the Husky. I think the KTM is right up there. So I have the Yamaha clearly above the rest for me. It just fits whatever Jimmy's style is, and that tuner app makes stuff, it just makes it so I can tune the bike in anything. Although I found that adding a tooth to the sprocket one day transformed the bike.
Taking a tooth away.
Oh, taking a tooth away. Yeah, that's right. I'm not motocross action.
Right.
Yeah. So dirt bike test, we take a tooth away, goes faster. And then like I said, so the KTM is right there in the same boat as the Honda, is the same boat as the Kawasaki, and then for me the Husqvarna and the Suzuki, or maybe in the other order, the Suzuki and the Husqvarna are down in the lower ranks when it comes to stuff. But collectively, and I think we can all agree, and we did not set out, we actually said we're not gonna pick a winner, but it's kind of hard not to when we start talking about adding everything up. What is clear is that the Yamaha seemed to fit the widest scope range of riders. And if we didn't know anything about you as a consumer and you said, I want a 450 motocross bike, we would be very safe in saying that you would like the Yamaha.
Yeah.
You might have other things that you would pick across the board, but I frankly, I was kind of surprised. I did not think that there would be a bike that would stand out as good as all these bikes were, so vividly when we read the results. And this is something you can do when you look at our test, when we do our write-up that's on the website. You can look and see the opinions, and then you can pick and pull apart and kind of see what might fit your taste. So hopefully that gives you an idea if you've lasted this long in this video. We like doing a very detailed explanation of this stuff. So we'll put some, definitely a lot of effort into producing the stuff that you're going to see on the website, and If you like what you saw, make sure you like it. Share this stuff with everybody. And for sure, you can always buy yourself a really nice Dirt Bike Test t-shirt. Except for that one, that's super custom. You can't even get those anymore.
Special.
Or your hat.
Yeah, the hat's super custom as well. So anyways, hope to see you guys on the next round, and catch it later.
Thanks.